He is intriguing, yet unpredictable. He demands unconditional loyalty. He seems to have an intuitive understanding of what people want to hear, but no actual empathy. He treats others as simply bodies or objects. And he's surrounded by a network of subordinates, but the personnel is always changing. Does it sound like I'm talking about the president? Because these are, according to Alexandra Stein, qualities of a cult leader. Hi. My name is Ian Danskin. I'm a video essayist and media artist. I run a YouTube channel called Innuendo Studios, the flagship endeavor of which is currently the AltRight Playbook, a series on the political and rhetorical strategies the AltRight uses to legitimize itself and gain power. And if that sounds interesting to you and you haven't already, please like, share, and subscribe. The most recent episode of the AltRight Playbook is about how people get recruited into these largely online reactionary communities like the AltRight, a subject which, as it turns out, is real fucking hard to research. What I want to talk about today with you is how I go about studying a population that is incredibly hostile towards being studied. It involves finding the bits and pieces on the alt-right that we do have data on, the pockets of good research, the outsider observations, the stories of lived experience, as well as looking at older movements the alt-right grew out of that have been extensively researched and spotting the ways that the alt-right is continuous with them, and trying to extrapolate how those structures might recreate themselves in the social media age. So it's a lot. And in the process of researching, I found a wealth of interesting perspectives that, by focusing the video on recruitment in specific, I barely dipped a toe in. And all that stuff is what I'd like to get into with you today. But I'm trying to thread a needle here. You don't need to have seen my video, How to Radicalize a Normie, to follow this talk, but if you have seen it already, I'll try not to be redundant. This talk is one part making my case for why I think the conclusions in that video are correct, one part repository for all the stuff I couldn't get into, and one part how I've come to look at the alt-right as a result of this research, including some pet theories that I wouldn't feel right claiming as truth without further research, but I do think are on the right track. This talk is called Isolation, Engulfment, and Pain, How the Alt-Right is Like an Abusive Relationship. We're going to cover a lot of ground, from information processing to emotional development, but we're necessarily going to cover racism and violence and abuse dynamics. So this is an introduction and a content warning. If some of these subjects are particularly charged for you, no offense will be taken if at any point you leave the room. I have to research this stuff for a living, and it is rough. So sometimes even I have to step away. We don't judge here. Now, requisite dash of self-deprecation. Don't give me too much credit for all this. I am proud of the work I do, and I think I'm genuinely good at it, but most of this video was compiling the work of others. Besides research I had already done and my own observations, the video had 27 sources, 3 books, 5 research papers, 6 articles, 1 leaked document, 3 testimonials, 4 videos, 4 pages of statistics. Keynote just closed. That's exciting.
You got a little too fast, I guess.
I'm sorry. I just get excited.
No, oops, let's go back. Where were you?
I'm a ways. Right around there. Okay. This is the 3 testimonials, 4 videos, 4 pages of statistics. We're going to take it slowly. And 1 Twitter joke. I also spoke to 4 professional researchers who study right-wing extremism and 1 former alt-righter. So without all their hard work, I would have nothing to compile. Okay? Let's begin. We're going to center on those 3 main texts: Alt America by David Neiwert, A History of the Alt-Right's Origins; Healing from Hate by Michael Kimmel, about how young men get into and out of extremist groups, be they neo-Nazi or jihadist; and Terror, Love, and Brainwashing by Alexandra Stein, about how people are courted by and sometimes kept inside cults and totalitarian regimes. I began with Kimmel. The premise of healing from hate is that extremist groups tend to be between 75 and 90% male, and that you cannot understand radical conservatism without looking at it through the lens of toxic masculinity. Which makes it all the more disappointing that Kimmel has been accused by multiple women of bullying and harassment. I found the book incredibly useful, and we're still going to talk about it. I just need to caveat here that retweets are not endorsements. Also, if I spoil the book for you, then you don't need to buy it. Give your money to someone who isn't a creep. Kimmel's argument is that extremism begins with a pain peculiar to young men. He calls it aggrieved entitlement. I call it Durden syndrome. You know that scene in Fight Club where Tyler says we've all been raised by television to believe that one day we'd all be millionaires and movie gods and rock stars, but we won't, and we're slowly learning that fact, and we are very, very pissed off. Yeah, that. As men, the world promised us something, and the promise wasn't kept. Now, some men skew towards social progressivism when they realize that this promise was never made to women or men of color or queer or trans or non-binary people, and recognize the injustice of that. And some men skew towards economic leftism when they realize that every cis-het white man being a millionaire rock star movie god is mathematically impossible. But they skew towards reactionary conservatism when they feel the promise should have been kept. That's the life they were supposed to have, and someone took it from them. Hate groups appeal to that sense of emasculation. You want to be a real man? Shave off your hair, dance to hatecore, and let's beat the crap out of someone. Kimmel notes that the greatest indicator someone will join a hate group is a broken home, divorce, foster care, parents with addictions, physical or sexual abuse. The greater the distance between the life they were promised and the one they are living, the more enticing real masculinity becomes. Their fellow extremists are brothers, and the leaders father figures. The group does give them someone to blame for their lot in life, be it immigrants, feminists, or the Jewish conspiracy, but that's not why they join. They're after empowerment. According to Kimmel, their embrace of neo-Nazi ideology is a consequence of their recruitment and indoctrination process, not its cause. But once an other has been identified as the locus of a hate group's hate, the new recruits are brought along when that group goes and terrorizes the other. Events like cross-burnings and street fights are dangerous and morally fraught, and are often traumatic for a new recruit. And experiencing an emotional trauma can create an intense bond with the people experiencing it with him, even though they're the ones who brought him to the traumatic event in the first place. The creation of this bond is one of the reasons that some hate groups usher new recruits out into the field as early as possible. The sooner they are emotionally invested in the community, the faster they will embrace the community's politics. This othering also estranges them from the people they are supposed to hate, which makes it harder to stop hating them. So there's this concept that comes up a lot in my research. It's called contact hypothesis. Contact hypothesis argues that the more contact you have with a different walk of life, the easier it is to tolerate it. It's like exposure therapy. We talk about how big cities and college campuses tend to be liberal strongholds. The right likes to claim it's because professors and politicians are poisoning your mind, but really it's just that they tend to be diverse. When you share space with a lot of different kinds of people, a degree of liberalism becomes necessary just to get by. And we see that belief systems which rely on a strict orthodoxy get really cagey about their members having contact with outsiders. We see this in all the groups we're discussing today, extremist cults and totalitarianism, but also religious fundamentalists. Mormons only want to send their kids to Brigham Young. They are belief systems that can only reliably be maintained so long as no one gets exposed to other people with other beliefs. So that's some of what I took from Kimmel. Next, I read Stein, talking primarily about cults. Stein's window into all of this is applying the theory of attachment styles to what researchers call totalism, which is any structure that subsumes a person's entire life the way that cults and totalitarian governments do. Attachment is a concept you may be familiar with if you have or have ever dated a therapist. I've done both. So for a quick primer, imagine you're walking in a park with a 3-year-old, and the 3-year-old sees a dog and asks, "Can I pet the dog?" And you say, "Yeah, go pet the dog." And the kid steps away from you, and they reach out. The dog gets excited and jumps up, and the kid gets scared and runs back to your side. And you hold the kid, and you go, "Oh, no, 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 it's okay, it's okay. They're not going to hurt you. They were just so happy to see you." And after a few moments, kid calms down, and then you say, do you still want to pet the dog? Kid says yes, so they step away from you again. They reach out. Dog jumps up again, but this time the kid steals themselves. They don't run away. And they pet the dog. And then the dog's happy, kid's happy, and you're happy. Success. So this is a fundamental piece of a child's emotional development. They take a risk, have a negative experience, and retreat to a point of comfort. Then, having received that comfort, they feel bolstered enough to take a slightly greater risk. A healthy childhood is steadily venturing further and further from that point of comfort and taking on greater risks, secure in the knowledge that safety is there when they need it. And as an adult, they will form many interdependent points of comfort rather than relying on only one or two. If all goes according to plan, that is secure attachment. But sometimes things go wrong when the kid seeks comfort and doesn't get enough. This may be because the adult is withholding, or the kid doesn't know how to express their needs, or they're just a particularly fearful child. But the kid may start seeking comfort more than seems reasonable, and be particularly averse to risk, and over-focus on the people who give them comfort because they're operating at a deficit. We call that anxious attachment. Alternately, kid may give up on receiving comfort altogether, even though they still need it, and just go it alone, developing a distrust of other people and a fear of being vulnerable. We call that avoidant attachment. Now, these styles are all formed in early childhood, but Stein focuses on a fourth kind of attachment style that can be formed at any age, regardless of the style you came in with. It's what happens when the negative experience and the comfort come from the same place. We see it in children and adults who are mistreated by the people they trust. It's called disorganized attachment. According to Stein, cults foster disorganized attachment by being intensely unpredictable. In a cult, you may be praised for your commitment on Monday and have your commitment questioned on Tuesday, with no change in your behavior. You may be assigned a romantic partner who may at any point be taken away, assigned to someone else. Your children may be taken from you to be raised by a different family. You may be told the cult leader wants to sleep with you, which might make you incredibly happy or be terrifying, but you won't be given a choice, and the rules you're expected to follow will be rewritten without warning. This creates a kind of emotional chaos, where you can't predict when you will be given good feelings and when you will be given bad ones. But you are so enmeshed in the community that you have no place else to go for good feelings. Hurting you just draws you in deeper, because they are where you go to seek comfort. And your pain is always your fault. You wouldn't feel so shitty if you were just more committed. Trying to make sense of this causes so much confusion and anguish that you eventually just stop thinking for yourself. These are the rules now? Okay. He's not my brother anymore? Okay. This is my life now? Okay. Now, hardly anyone would seek out such a dynamic, which is why cults present as religions, political activists, and therapy groups. Things that people in questioning phases of their life are liable to seek out. And then they fall down the rabbit hole before they know what's happening. The cult slowly consumes more and more of a recruit's life and tightly controls access to relationships outside the cult, because the biggest threat to a disorganized attachment relationship is having a separate, securely attached point of comfort. At this point, I said, hold up. You're telling me cults recruit by offering people community and purpose in times of need, become the focal point of their entire lives, estrange them from all outside perspectives, and then cause emotional distress that paradoxically makes them more committed because they have nowhere else to go for support? Isn't that exactly how Kimmel described joining a hate group? Now, these are commonalities. It's not a one-to-one comparison. A cult is far more organized and rigidly controlled than a hate group. But Stein points out that the dynamic of isolation, engulfment, and pain is the same dynamic as an abusive relationship. The difference is just scale. A cult is functionally a single person having a very complex domestic abuse situation with a whole lot of people, #bad polyamory. So if we posit a spectrum With domestic abuse on one end and cults and totalitarianism on the other, I started wondering, could we put extremist groups like ISIS and Aryan nations around here? And if so, where would we put the alt-right? Now, I have to tread carefully here. There are reasons this talk is called How the Alt-Right is Like an Abusive Relationship and not How the Alt-Right is Like a Cult, because the moment you say the second thing, a lot of people will stop listening to you. Our conception of cults and totalitarianism is way more controlled and structured than a pack of loud, racist assholes on the internet. But we're not talking about organizational structure. We're talking about a relationship, an emotional dynamic that Stein calls anxious dependency, which fosters an irrational loyalty to people who are bad for you and gets you to adopt an ideology you would have previously rejected. I would also love to go on a rant puncturing the idea that cultists and fascists are organized, pointing out that this notion is itself propaganda. Their systems are notoriously corrupt and mismanaged, but we don't have time. Ask me about it in the Q&A if you want to hear me go off. So I started looking through what I knew and what I could find about the alt-right to see if I could spot this same pattern of isolation, engulfment, and pain online, funneling people to the alt-right. And I did not come up short. Isolation? Well, the alt-right traffics in all the same dehumanizing narratives about their enemies as Kimmel's hate groups. Like, the worst things you can imagine a human being saying about a group of people are said every day in these forums. They often berate and harass each other for any perceived sympathies towards the other side. They also regularly harass people from the other side off of platforms and falsely report their tweets, posts, and videos as terrorism to get them taken down. This has happened to me, incidentally. I found figureheads adored by the alt-right who expressly tell people to cut ties with liberal family members. We talked before about contact hypothesis. There's also this idea called parasocial contact hypothesis. A parasocial relationship is a strong emotional connection that only goes one way. Like if you really love my videos and you started to think of me like almost as a friend, even though I don't know you exist, yeah, parasocial relationship. They've been in the discourse lately, largely thanks to my friend Shannon Strucci, making a really great video about them. You should check it out. I make a cameo, but clear your schedule. It's 2 hours long. Parasocial contact hypothesis is this phenomenon where if people form parasocial feelings for public figures or even fictional characters, and those people and characters happen to be black, white audiences become less racist, similar to how they would if they had black friends. Your logical brain knows that these are strangers, but the lizard brain doesn't know the difference between empathy for a queer person and empathy for a queer character in a video game. So of course the alt-right makes a big stink about queer characters in video games and leads boycotts against forced diversity because diverse media is bad for recruitment. Engulfment? Well, I learned way too much about how the alt-right will overtake your entire internet life. There was a paper made the rounds last year by Rebecca Lewis charting the interconnectedness of conservative YouTube. Reactionaries really, it would help for this slide if it was actually on screen. How do I go back? Here we go. Okay, it's not gonna happen. Reactionaries really hated this paper because it said things they didn't like. Lewis argues that once you enter what she calls the alternative influence network, it tends to keep you inside. Start with some YouTuber conservatives like, but who is branded as a moderate or even a classic liberal. Take someone like Dave Rubin. Call Dave Rubin alt-right and people yell at you. I speak from experience. Well, Dave Rubin has had Jordan Peterson on his show. So if you watch Rubin, Peterson ends up in your recommendations. Peterson has been on the Joe Rogan show, so you watch Peterson and Rogan ends up in your recommendations. And Rogan has interviewed Gavin McInnes, so you watch Rogan, McInnes ends up in your recommendations. Gavin McInnes is the head of the Proud Boys, a self-described Western chauvinist organization that's mostly known for beating up liberals and leftists. They have ties to neo-fascist groups like Identity Europa and neo-fascist militias like the Oath Keepers. They run security for white nationalists when they give speeches, and their lawyer just went on record saying that he identifies as a fascist. And if you're one of these kids that has YouTube on in the background with autoplay enabled, and you're watching Dave Rubin, you might be as few as 3 videos away from watching Gavin McInnes. There's a lot of talk these days about how algorithms funnel people towards the right, and it's not wrong, but it's an oversimplification. The real problem is that the right knows how to hijack algorithms. I also learned about the curation search radicalization spiral from a piece by Mike Caulfield. Caulfield uses the horrific example of Dylan Roof. You remember him? Shot up a church in a black neighborhood a few years ago. Roof says he was radicalized when he Googled black on white crime and saw the results. Now, if you search the phrase crime statistics by demographic, you will find fairly nonpartisan results that show that most crimes are committed against the members of the perpetrator's own race, and black people commit crimes against white people at about the same rate as any two demographics. But that specific phrase, black on white crime, is used almost exclusively by white racists. And so Roof's first hit wasn't a database of crime statistics, it was the Council of Conservative Citizens. Now, the CCC is an outgrowth of the white citizens' councils of the 50s and 60s, which rebranded in '85. They publish bogus statistics that paint black people as uniquely violent, and they introduce a number of other politically loaded phrases, like, say, Muslim fertility rates, that nonpartisan sites don't use. And so if Roof Googles them as well, he gets similarly weighted results. Now, I've got tons more examples of this stuff. I literally don't have time to show it all. Like, have you heard of Google bombing? That's a thing I didn't know existed. The point is, the same way search engines tailor your results to what they think you want, once you scratch the surface of the alt-right, they are highly adept at making it so whenever you go online, their version of reality is all you know and all you see. Finally, pain. This was the difficult one. Can you create a disorganized attachment relationship over the internet with a largely faceless and decentralized movement? I pitched the idea to one of the researchers I spoke to, and he said, "That sounds very plausible and nearly impossible to research." You see, cults and hate groups, they don't want to talk to researchers any more than the alt-right wants to talk to me. Stein and Kimmel get their data by speaking to formers, people who've exited these movements and are all too happy to share how horrible they were. But the alt-right is still very young, and there just aren't that many formers yet. I found some testimonials, and they mostly back up my hypothesis, but there's not enough that I could call them statistically significant. So I had to look at where the data was. My fellow YouTuber ContraPoints made a video last year, in my opinion, probably her best one, about InCells. That's involuntary celibate men who can't get laid. Incel forums tend to be deeply misogynistic and anti-feminist and have a high overlap with the alt-right. If you remember Elliot Rodger, he was an incel. Contra's observation is that these forums are incredibly fatalistic. You are too ugly and women too shallow for you to ever have sex, so you should just give up. She described a certain catharsis, like picking at a really painful scab, in hearing other people voice your worst fears. But there was no uplift. These communities seem to have a zero-tolerance policy for optimism. She likened it to some deeply unhealthy trans forums she used to visit where people just wallowed in their own dysphoria. And I remembered the forums I researched 5 years ago in preparation for my video on Gamergate. If you don't know what Gamergate was, I will not rob you of your precious innocence. But in a lot of ways, Gamergate was the trial run for what the alt-right has become. These forums were full of angry guys surrounding themselves with people saying, "You are right to be angry." And yeah, if everywhere else you go treats your anger as invalid, that scratches an itch. But I never saw any of them calm down. Like, they came in angry, and they left angrier, and most didn't have anywhere else to vent, so back they came. I found a paper on alt-right forums that described a similar type of nihilism, and another on 8chan. What humor was on these sites was always shocking and furiously punching down and deeply self-referential, but it didn't seem like anyone was expected to laugh anymore, just, catch the reference. I found one testimonial saying that having healthy relationships in these spaces is functionally impossible, and one former I talked to said, "Yeah, when the alt-right isn't winning, everyone's miserable." So I think it might fit. The place they go for relief also makes them unhappy, so they come back to get relief again, and it just repeats. Same reason people stay with abusers. I want to look into this further, so I'm just going to say this part to the camera. If there are any researchers watching and you want to study this, get at me. Innuendo Studios on Twitter. Finally, I read Alt America by David Neiwert, a supremely useful book that I highly recommend if you want to know how the alt-right is a natural outgrowth of the militia and patriot movements of the 90s and early 2000s, not to mention the Tea Party. Neiwert also does an excellent job illustrating how conspiracism serves to fill in the gap between the complexity of the modern world and the comparative simplicity of the might makes right worldview of fascism. Neiwert also provides an interesting piece of the puzzle, suggesting what people are actually looking for when they get recruited. He references work done by John Barg and Caitlin McKenna on identity demarginalization. Barg and McKenna look at the internet habits of people whose identities are both devalued by society and invisible. And by invisible, what I mean is, okay, if you're a person of color, our society devalues your identity, but you can look around a room and, within a certain margin of error, see who else is POC and form community with them if you wish. But if you're queer, you can't see who else in the room is queer unless one of you runs up a flag. And revealing yourself always means taking on a certain amount of risk, that you've misread the signals and the person you're revealing yourself to isn't only not queer, but a homophobe. According to Barg and McKenna, people in this situation are much more likely to seek online spaces that self-select for that identity. A fan forum for RuPaul's Drag Race is maybe a safer place to come out and find community. And people tend to get very emotionally tied to these online spaces where they can be themselves. Neiwert points out that the same phenomenon happens among privileged people who have identities that are devalued even as they're not actually oppressed. Say, nerds, or conservatives in liberal towns, or men who don't fit traditional notions of masculinity. They are also likely to deeply invest themselves in online spaces made for them. And if the far right can build such a community, or get a foothold in one that already exists, it is very easy to channel that sense of marginalization into Durden syndrome. I connected this with Rebecca Lewis's observation that the alternative influence network tends to present itself as nerd-focused life advice first and politics second, and the long history of reactionaries recruiting from fandoms. So I can see all the pieces of this abuse dynamic being recreated here. Offer you something you need, estrange you from other perspectives and healthy relationships, overtake your life, and provoke emotional distress that makes you seek comfort that only your abuser is offering. And I found a lot more parallels than what I'm sharing right now. I only have half an hour. But the thing that's missing, that's usually central to such a system, is an abusive relationship orbits around the abuser, a cult around the cult leader, a totalitarian government around a dictator. They are built to serve the whims of an individual. But I look at the ad hoc nature of the alt-right, and I have to ask, who is the architect? I can see a lot of people profiting off of this structure. Our current president wrote it to great success, but he didn't build it. It predates him. It's more like Kimmel's hate groups, which don't promote an individual so much as a class of individuals. But even then, their structure is much more deliberate, designed, where the alt-right seems almost improvised. Well, one observation I took from Stein is that cult recruiters often rely on two different kinds of propaganda, the winding diatribe and the thought-terminating cliche. The diatribe is when someone talks at length, sounds smart, and seems to know what they're talking about, but isn't actually making any sense. And the thought-terminating cliche comes from Robert J. Lifton's studies into brainwashing. So when I went vegetarian in middle school, I would sometimes tell other kids I was vegetarian, and sometimes they'd get really defensive with me and say things like, humans aren't meant to be vegetarian, it's the food chain. Now saying it's the food chain isn't meant to be a good argument, it's meant to communicate I have said something so axiomatically true that the argument need not continue. That's a thought-terminating cliche, something that may not be true but feels true and gives you permission to think about something else. Both of these techniques rely on what's called peripheral root processing. So I'm up here talking about politics, and Solidarity Lowell, you are a group of politically engaged people, so you probably have enough context to know whether I'm talking out of my ass. That's direct root processing, where you can judge the contents of my argument. But if I were up here talking about string theory, you might not know whether I was talking out of my ass because there's only so many people on Earth who understand string theory. So then you might look at secondary characteristics of my argument. The fact that I've been invited to speak on string theory implies that I might know what I'm talking about. Maybe I put up a lot of equations and name drop a lot of mathematicians and claim they agree with me. Maybe I just sound really authoritative. All of that is peripheral root processing, judging the quality of my argument by how it's delivered. Every act of communication involves both. But if you're trying to sell people on something that's fundamentally irrational, you're going to rely heavily on peripheral root tactics, which is what the winding diatribe and the thought-terminating cliche are. Now, I noticed that these two methods mapped pretty cleanly onto the rhetorical stylings of Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro, but here's the question. Cults use these techniques to recruit people. But can I say with any confidence that Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro are trying to recruit people to the alt-right? The thing is, alt-right isn't a term like Klansman. It's more akin to a term like modernism. It's a label applied to a trend. In the same way we debate the line between modernism and postmodernism, we debate the line between right and alt-right. People don't sign up to be in the alt-right. You are alt-right if you say you're alt-right. But the nature of the alt-right is 90% of them would never admit it. So are Peterson and Shapiro intentionally recruiting people to the alt-right? Are they grifters merely profiting off of the alt-right? Are they even aware that they're recruiting people to the alt-right? Part of my work has been accepting that you can't know for sure. I think it would be naive to say they're unaware. When they give speeches, they get Nazis in their Q&As, and they know that. But how aware are they? I suspect Shapiro more so than Peterson, but that's just my gut talking, and I can't prove it. Like 90% of the alt-right, it's debatable. I don't know if they're trying to be part of this system. I just know they're not trying not to be. Final academic term before we say goodnight that's been making the rounds among lefty YouTubers is stochastic terrorism. There's a really great video about this by the channel Non-Compete called The Pewdie Pipeline. Stochastic terrorism is the myriad ways that you can increase the likelihood that someone will commit violence without ever actually telling them to. You simply create an environment in which lone wolf violence becomes more acceptable and appealing. It mirrors the structure of terrorism without the control or culpability. And I hear about this, and I look at the recruitment structure I see approximated in the alt-right. And I remember something I learned much earlier in my research from Bob Altemeyer in his book, The Authoritarians. Altemeyer has been studying authoritarianism for decades. He has a wealth of data, and one thing he observes is that authoritarianism is the few exerting power over the many, which means there's two types of authoritarians, the ones who lead and the ones who follow. Turns out those are completely different personality profiles. Followers don't want to be in charge. They want someone to tell them what to do, to say you're the good guys and put them in charge of punishing the bad guys. They don't even care who the bad guys are. Part of the appeal is that someone else makes that judgment for them. So if you can encourage a degree of authoritarian sentiment in people, get them wanting nothing more than to be ensconced in a totalist system that will take their agency away from them, putting them in the orbit of an authoritarian leader, but no leader presents themselves, can you just kind of appoint one? Like, if you don't have a leader, can you just find yourself an authoritarian and treat him like one? And if he doesn't give you enough directives, can you just make some up? And if you don't have recruiters, can you find a conservative who speaks in thought-terminating cliches, mainly just because he thinks they win arguments? Or find a conservative who speaks in meaningless diatribes because he genuinely thinks he's making sense? And then maneuver those speeches and videos in front of the people you want to recruit? If you're sick of waiting for Moses to come down the mountain with the word of God, can you just build your own God from whatever's handy? Every piece of this structure, you can find people, algorithms, and arguments that, put in a sequence, can generate disorganized attachment whether they're trying to or not, which makes every part plausibly deniable, debatable. You just need to make it profitable enough for the ones involved that they don't try to fix it. This is a system created collaboratively, on the fly, with the help of a lot of people from hate movements past, mostly by throwing a ton of shit against the wall and seeing what sticks. The alt-right is a rapidly mutating virus, and the web is the perfect incubator. It very quickly finds a structure that works, and it's a structure we've seen before, just a little weirder this time. I've started calling this Stochastic Totalism. Now, again, I'm not a professional researcher. I do my homework, but I don't have the background. I have an art degree. This is something I can't prove so much as a way I've come to look at the alt-right that makes sense to me and helps me understand them. And I got a lot of comments from my last video from people who used to be alt-right that echoed my assumptions, but don't take it as gospel. Mostly I wanted to share it because if it can help you make sense of what we're dealing with, I think it's worth putting out there. Thank you.